Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Lauren, and I'm a project leader at the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. Over the next hour, we will be discussing online hate targeting Indigenous peoples and some recommendations for combating its prevalence and impact. We'll have 10 minutes just at the end of this session for audience questions, so please feel free to type any questions you might have into the comments section on the platform you are viewing on, and we'll make sure that our lovely moderator gets it. This event is part of a series of roundtable events that we are organizing as part of the Digital Peace Project. The Digital Peace Project seeks to build upon the UN strategy and plan of action on hate speech and contribute to national efforts to mitigate online hate while respecting freedom of speech. This project aims to increase the capacity of ethnic and cultural communities to address online racism and discrimination by centering their perspectives and opinions while exploring ideas for solutions. This project is funded by Heritage Canada's Community Support, Multiculturalism, and Anti-Racism Initiatives program, and we're really grateful for their funding. I would also like to thank Concordia University's Indigenous Directions Office for partnering with us for this event. I will turn it over to Aidan just in a moment here to chat more about Indigenous Directions, but I briefly wanted to introduce our wonderful moderator of today. Christy Snell is with us. She's the academic director and journalistic leader in residence at Concordia University's Institute for Inclusive, Investigative, and Innovative Journalism, or I3J. She has previously delivered morning radio newscasts for CBC and taught the Reporting in Indigenous Communities course at CBC as well. She's a member of the Standing Buffalo Dakota Nation. Thanks so much for being here, Christy, and I'll turn it over to Aidan.
Thank you, Lauren. Gwayam Sitwen. Hello, everyone. My name is Aidan Tecumseh. I'm Mi'kmaq from the community of Gueskabigia, and as mentioned, I work for the Office of Indigenous Directions, and I'm also a student majoring in First People Studies and minoring in Law and Society. To give a general overview of what we do, the Office of Indigenous Directions leads the implementation of the Indigenous Directions Action Plan, which works to decolonize and indigenize the university, which can sometimes involve developing policies and consulting with different groups. We work closely with other Indigenous faculty and staff and students. And as the events coordinator, I help organize events that highlight and celebrate Indigenous cultures. Some of our previous events include various panel discussions, guest speakers, and most recently, our Miwachimo Storytellers Competition. Now we're grateful to have been able to partner with the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies and contribute to the Digital Peace Project to discuss the issue of online hate towards Indigenous peoples. But before we begin the event, we'd like to acknowledge that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation are recognized as the custodians of the land and waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke is historically known as the gathering place for many First Nations, and today is a home of a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future, and the ongoing relationships with Indigenous peoples and other peoples within the Montreal community. So thank you very much, and I hope you all really enjoy the panel. I'll now hand it over to our moderator for today's event, Christy.
Thanks so much. And thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here today talking about this important issue. This is an issue that I am close to. I have a lot of Indigenous colleagues and friends who are dealing with online hate every single day, from racist comments to being called names to having their inboxes filled with hate mail after they publish certain types of stories. In 2015, CBC made the decision to temporarily close comment threads on most Indigenous-related stories that it posts online. It was finding a disproportionate number of comments were crossing the line. Some were based in ignorance, but many were clearly hateful. So this is where we find ourselves. It's a very real concern for Indigenous people looking to share their knowledge and speak their truth online. So we want to look today at what can be done to deal with the problem. So I'm joined today by four amazing people who are going to be discussing this. We'll have time for questions, as was mentioned from the people watching in just a bit, but we'll start with some introductions. So what I'll do is I'll do a little introduction for each of our panelists, then they'll each speak for about 5 minutes, sort of introduction to their work and their experience in dealing with this, and then we'll have some questions. So I'll start with Bailey Oster. She's a Métis woman with roots in the Red River settlement in St. Paul des Métis. She's vice president of New Dawn, the Métis women's organization within Alberta, and the youth programs and services director at Métis Nation of Alberta. And Bailey, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. So would you like me to just jump into the 5 minutes right now? Is that?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So yes, thank you so much, Christy, and thank you to Migs for setting this up. And like I was introduced, my name is Bailey Oster. I'm the Youth Programs and Services Director of the Métis Nation of Alberta, and I recently actually also had the opportunity to attend CSW 67 at the United Nations. So that's the Commission for the Status of Women at the United Nations. And just as a little something that I thought was interesting in attending that was, I went on behalf of Métis National Council, and there wasn't a single side event or panel put together that focused on Indigenous issues. And the topic that they were covering was technology. And I had been told that the year previous, when the topic was climate change, there was 9 or 10 Indigenous panels. So I thought it was just really interesting that when they thought of technology, they didn't assume that Indigenous people had anything to say, or didn't assume that this was an issue that impacted Indigenous people's lives. And that was almost comical to me, because it's obvious, even by the conversations we're going to have today, that technology, all the way back from like times of colonization, has impacted Indigenous people disproportionately in negative and positive ways. And we're going to talk about how that's continued on today. But to start, I want to talk a little bit about my experience with the social internet, which is what I'm going to call it, because I tend to think that's where Indigenous people face the most hate, is the social internet. It's the social media platforms. It's, anywhere online where we interact socially. And how I think it relates on both a micro and macro scale to the discussion we're going to have here today. So I'm currently 28 years old, and I'm kind of from that last generation to grow up without a phone in my pocket and readily available internet access. Although by the time I was a teenager, these things were quickly becoming more and more relevant to my life and more common for people my age to have. But I really feel for especially the young people growing up in these next generations, always having the social internet in their pocket, always having access to social media, always having access to everyone around them's opinions and ideas. Navigating these spaces isn't easy, even for an adult, between constant comparison to your peers, cyberbullying, and online hate. There's a lot to deal with for someone. But despite this, I'm still an advocate for the use of the social internet. I don't think that it's all bad. I think that there are ways to use these spaces that can be really positive for community building. And it's discussions on how to make these spaces safer for us as Indigenous people. How do we make these spaces safe, basically? The social internet, it's a way for people to connect. It can be a safe space for someone who needs community or connection and may not be able to get that in their real life. There are millions of spaces across the internet for, people with niche interests or life experiences, or someone who might be, 2S LGBTQ plus and just doesn't know where they fit in. These are places where you can gather, you can connect, you can create relationships with each other and create kinship ties. And so for all the bad we see out there, there's a lot of good as well. And this revolution of communication is the largest technological revolution that we've had as a people since the printing press. And we're really only in the beginning stages of that revolution. And we have no idea what the long-term consequences will be for humanity in the world. So we have to go about navigating these spaces the best way we know how today. But of course, in Canada, Indigenous people face far more hate online than non-Indigenous people. As Christy mentioned in her introduction, just the fact that CBC felt the need to block comments specifically on Indigenous issues because of the amount of hate and vitriol that they get. Journalists in Canada, especially female journalists, and especially female journalists of color, specifically Indigenous women, which is what my focus is on, receive a disproportionate amount of hate. And that causes impacts on their psychological health, even their physical health, the kind of stress that can put on your body. How does it drive people away from those careers, never mind just in their social life? But I think that, as Indigenous people, we don't necessarily have the ability to influence algorithms or convince billionaire CEOs or international governments to make these spaces safer for us. But I'm still an advocate for using these online spaces, because while they have undeniable issues, they're an incredibly powerful tool that we can use to create community and start movements that can and will change the world. So movements like I Don't Know More here in Canada, or Black Lives Matter in the States, have had incredible impacts across the world, and they're tangible proof of the power of the internet and what minority groups, Indigenous groups can do when they come together for a common cause. These movements started online and are still impacting our world today, and they show us the power of connection through fighting for a common purpose. But in terms of how to keep yourself safe from online hate, I don't have all the answers, but I do know, don't be afraid to use the tools that social media gives you to make yourself safe. Like, free speech is important, but if you are receiving hate online, use that block button with abandon. Do not be scared to block people who make you feel unsafe. Mute keywords that you might find triggering. If people are coming at you and you are, a young person on the internet, do what you have to do to stay safe. Find online spaces that make you feel comfortable. There are tons of communities out there that aren't, that don't spew that online hate, that are safe for people. And don't be afraid to fight for those spaces to remain safe. Practice self-care and collaborate with your peers, and just, we're going to talk a lot more about it later. But that's just kind of my perspective on the internet. Personally, I kind of stay off the social internet except to watch, because I don't want to put up with that criticism, and that's my own choice. So, yeah, that's kind of where I come from. Thank you so much again for having me, and I look forward to having this discussion further.
Excellent, Bailey. Thanks so much. A lot to discuss there already. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Suzanne Kite. She's an Oglala Lakota performance artist, visual artist, and composer, raised in Southern California, also research assistant at the Initiative for Indigenous Futures, and PhD student at Concordia University. Suzanne, welcome.
Hi, hihani washte, Suzanne Kadamacha Pikashto, Oglala Hamacha, Chante washte anape chuzupo. My relatives, I shake your hands with a happy heart. My name is Dr. Suzanne Kite. I'm no longer a PhD student. I'm all done, and I'm so happy about that. Very recent. I am very grateful to be invited here today amongst really awesome colleagues. I wanted to speak briefly about my perspectives. I'm coming from a few perspectives. First of all, is my research into our Indigenous ethics and their possible future intersections with artificial intelligence, and the ways that my lived experience kind of interface with that. So, as an Lakota woman, and moving through racism and is a daily part of reality. And it's taken me sometimes I feel like we can compartmentalize racism and kind of feel it, especially with the online stuff. I feel like it can move through quickly and it can feel like a news story, but for example, reading a very harsh headline, and seeing the really racist comments under it is just one of the parts of algorithmic bias and the policies that news and even just computational companies and systems and social media companies and the kind of dawning of the ChatGPT, artificial intelligence, natural language processing era that we're entering, all of those things, to me, come from root issues. The root issue of white supremacy, racism, imperialism, and colonialism, and all of those things to me are essential bottom line issues that just emerge in these online situations as symptoms of these deeper cancerous problems. But to me, I always have to remember that these problems are choices by real people, just as we're real people, and racism really physically hurts us and hurts our children. The world that it's made, the world that creates those issues, all those people are human beings who are making a choice to do that. And I also wanted to touch briefly on that how safety, and I love what was just said by Bailey, that the safety to me begins with the tools from the ground up, tools that are built by these Western hegemonic powers are built with these racisms ingrained, and although they can be subtle at first, they always do present themselves. I also think about the places online that I do feel good at, and actually sometimes face private, my pretty private family focused Facebook, which only got family members on it, feels awesome and feels super supportive. Don't speak to other people. But then my other favorite groups are like ribbon skirt groups where people are very, very supportive, shockingly supportive sometimes. Recently, I self-published an essay, so I'm a fine artist and I work professionally in the art world. And I recently self-published an essay on my website called "Postmodernism is Not Permission," about an artist in my community who was using Indigenous symbols and using my work as examples in ways that I felt were extremely inappropriate and racist. So I wrote an essay about that. I didn't name that person, but in the process, they began to attack me and call me evil. They kind of mounted this racist and hateful attacks on me, and I was just blown away that in 2023 that someone could be openly and outrightingly attack a Native woman and still be employed. They recently had an exhibition at the Tulsa Artist Fellowship, and people continue to work with them. And again, to me, that is because racism is a network of white supremacy, and an online racism is only part of the work that has to be done. And we know this. I mean, we're just talking about one facet of racism. But when someone is listening to Indigenous voices online, and there should be repercussions in the real world where those voices are taken seriously, and racism against Indigenous people is taken extremely seriously. And since living in Canada a little bit and living in the United States, I know it's not great in Canada for Indigenous peoples either, but I am shocked sometimes at how supportive I've felt in Canada, versus in the United States, where racism against Indigenous people is swept under the rug so extremely. It takes so much to hold someone accountable. So thank you for having me. I could continue to talk about this a lot, but thanks so much.
Thanks, Suzanne. We're looking forward to getting a bit deeper into some of the things you mentioned there. Megan Tippler is our next panelist. She's a Métis educator who works as the Indigenous Strategies Manager in the Office of the Vice Provost, Indigenous Programming and Research at University of Alberta. Megan, welcome.
Thank you. That's a mouthful of an office, hey? Yeah, I like tough acts to follow. Bailey was talking and I'm like, oh my God, what she said. But I guess like my experience is a little bit different because I guess I still do have a somewhat visible social media platform. When I was a school teacher, I had a page that I'd started actually originally just to communicate with kids. It was like reminders about, permission slips and things like that. And at some point I'd started posting like book recommendations and Indigenous literatures and and artwork, and it blew up a little bit. And so I had this unexpected platform. And so some of the things that are being talked about in terms of like safety and like etiquette and interactions, those are definitely things I've experienced. That being said, I also am really trying to remain hopeful in these social media spaces because I do see the positive shifts as well. And so even when there's those like really negative, horrible comments, my experience in the last couple of years has been that people step in, which wasn't necessarily the case, 3, 4, 5 years ago. You would see, comments on Facebook articles or things like that. And it would just be an onslaught of disrespect and hatred. And it felt really dangerous to step in and say anything. Whereas now I find that there's more people, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, challenging some of that just because of the shift in public consciousness and public education. And we definitely have a long way to go. But it's interesting to me that that's like all in some ways reassuring, like that, yes, that hatefulness is still there, but that it's not going unchecked or unchallenged. Um, and then just as far as like dissemination of knowledge, like I think for me, the upside of social media is accessibility and representation. Being able to see and find community in ways that we weren't before. And Bailey touched on, like social movements like Idle No More, where like, Facebook was a huge part of that. Being able to get that information out and communicated across the country in a timely way to catalyze people into action is so important. And we're still seeing that that's possible, but I also think that there's like an element of like social media activism where it's just people posting and then there's no action following it as well. So those things kind of have to exist in partnership, like we've seen can be done. But yeah, for me, like a lot of the hate stems from the fact that like social media gives a platform to Indigenous people that didn't previously exist, that they can exist unapologetically, and that is uncomfortable for people who are not used to seeing Indigenous people outside of the margins. And so that's where we see like, the response is so horrendous. I don't even know what word to use. I just keep using the same words because it's I try to think of why does that response happen, and especially because I'm in education, I'm in this teacher education space, and thinking like, what are we doing in schools that people are still so misinformed and still so ignorant that's their response, and how we cultivated that across generations that we're seeing people feel comfortable to say those things in these very public forums and not feel any shame for it. But then again, like the positive for me is that reclamation of space and that representation. But I do think like, both people who spoke before me, like speaking about youth as well and like the impact on them and the pressures. I know that I feel like I'm pushed into scenarios where I have to have all the answers at times. And even in comment sections when people they're attacking you and you feel obligated to respond. And then if you don't, then it's another, oh, you're too scared to respond. Oh, I'm right. Oh, you're this or that. So it's very antagonistic. And it can be very difficult to remove yourself from those situations, even as someone who's used to doing it or has like, become accustomed to social media. So that safety piece is definitely still, a work in progress. And then, yeah, the bias within social media, like Suzanne was saying, there's an algorithm bias, and that is part of the ingrained nature of colonialism and everything that's around us. The other thing I would say is I think that specifically on like Indigenous social media, like collectives, I think it's provided some insight into intersectionality as well, because, even as far as like there was the Sephora campaign like a year or two ago, and people, may notice like, well, where's like the Afro-Indigenous representation? Where are the bigger bodies? Where are the disabled bodies? Where are, the 2S LGBTQ plus like visible representation, things like that. And so I think it allows us to have these conversations that are more nuanced, or there's potential for it. It's not always able to happen, but yeah, I think for me, I'm really trying to find the hopefulness in social media, especially just because it is something that I'm on so frequently. But yeah, I don't have all the answers either, but I'm happy for this conversation.
Thanks very much, Megan, and hopefully we do come up with some answers today. Our next panelist is Catherine Martin. Unfortunately, she's having a bit of trouble getting connected, some technical gremlins today, so we're hoping that she can join us along the way. But in the meantime, we're just going to sort of move forward. And a couple of you addressed this a bit. And I think that it's probably the best way to start is looking a bit at causes of online hate towards Indigenous people? All of you work in different fields, coming from the art world, education, academia. So I'm just going to put this to everyone, and whoever wants to pick it up can, and we'll just have the conversation that way. But why are we seeing so much of this?
I guess I'll jump in. I think what Megan said is a really interesting point about, suddenly now Indigenous people have a voice and there's no way to avoid us, I guess. And that makes people who might have racial bias or, would be hateful, that suddenly makes them come out of the woodwork because now suddenly we're very visible. These stories wouldn't have been posted before. Or they wouldn't have been viewed, they wouldn't have been deemed as important, but now people care. And that makes people uncomfortable who don't care about Indigenous people or who maybe have negative intentions. And you see a lot of that pushback because people's viewpoints on the world, people's perspectives on life are being disrupted. And that disruption is hard. And if you're not prepared to deal with it, if you're not prepared to think through your already preconceived biases, that's going to come through as hate. And social media in particular is bad because we have this idea of the keyboard warrior. Now suddenly you can say things behind a screen that you would never, ever be willing to say to someone's face. And I think that can perpetuate a lot of hate, the anonymity that social media brings. While, in some ways can be a really positive thing for people who are trying to learn who they are, or trying to grow, or trying to just navigate these spaces, it can also cause a lot of harm because not only do we have people who can, hide behind their keyboards, we also have, maybe bad actors and bots who even add to the problem as well. And that hate can perpetuate hate, and we can come up with these really toxic online spaces. So that's kind of my thoughts about that. I'm not sure if any of the other panelists have any ideas as well.
Does anyone want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. I was particularly thinking about how bias in these mechanisms is, as I often think about choice in the process of choice in terms of making ethical decisions, and how, thinking about, not to say that Indigenous communities are not immune from being hateful, because online too, especially around specifically Lakota language, there's an extreme amount of vitriol, person to person on Facebook. So that's definitely, but that's, there are limits to those arguments. And that's because people feel deep responsibility towards each other's families. It's not hate, it's disagreement. And I see the edges of that in the way people make their choices and how they cite their sources and how they think about themselves as members of a community who are responsible to that community. And that responsibility is, to me, one of the key aspects of how things emerge as ethical or harmful. And the way I see it with the way online platforms are set up right now is no one feels responsible towards anyone. And while when I was young, it felt amazing to be totally anonymous on the Wild West of the internet, let's say, it felt awesome because I did not have to be responsible to anyone. But we live in a very real world, and the choices that people make are what it reflects exactly their values and whom they feel responsible to. So one of the other arguments that I lean on heavily in terms of artificial intelligence and computational systems is that to me, this is an ontological problem where the beinghood of other people and other animals, non-human beings, seen and unseen, but especially human beings, is not seen. They're not seen as persons, as having interiority, as being important enough to be on the same level as a white person, and not the same level as a settler. And so what we're experiencing online is, they see our humanity, like in a news story, or a cry out to community to say, you've done something that's going to hurt us or that is harmful, or I'm hurt by this. When the response is hate and anger, I think it's part of it is this confrontation with the possible beinghood of someone that that seems to challenge who they are, and that unknown somehow is so terrifying that it reflects all of the genocidal and murderous habits of their forefathers. And so when I think that when it comes to these online spaces, and when one sees a little bit of racism, that I still do not want that to be Indigenous people's responsibility to have to come out and say, this is so wrong. The responsibility then needs to be transferred to other white people who's come in, other settlers, and say, this is wrong and I won't stand for it. Yeah, I'll stop there.
That's an interesting point you make about responsibility, and the responsibility of Indigenous peoples to say something about it, which is sort of almost like double work. You know, you're putting your thoughts out there, and that sort of thing. How can you get other people to step up, non-Indigenous people to step up and actually say something about this?
I can jump in. I just carrying off the last question, like the thing that is difficult in asking this is that, like, the accountability piece for me, people dogpile, right? So, and not always, but I think that there are conversations that lose their nuance online. And so when Suzanne was talking, I was thinking, like, there's times, like, in person, if you had like an auntie check you and say, like, hey, you can't do that, or you need to go, that's not protocol, or this is, like, and they are providing that gentle correction. Whereas in online space, like, an Indigenous person might provide that correction to another Indigenous person, and then all of a sudden there's non-Indigenous people interjecting, being like, yeah, how could you do that, blah blah. And we've seen that play out, especially I feel like on TikTok, where videos and information and comments are just like, they're so quick, and people jump into the conversations they shouldn't be part of. And so it's challenging to ask people to say, yes, we want you to step in, but you also need to be able to recognize when you're not supposed to be part of the conversation. And so when the hate is coming from just from like comment section, like I talked about earlier, or like just, that vitriol that appears just in response to our presence or our being, absolutely. Like, I don't want to deal with those comments in the comment section, calling me a squaw, calling me, like any name that they can think of, just because I've challenged their conception of the world. And I don't want to get into that back and forth. So yes, I want somebody to be able to step in and say, like, hey, I will provide this, like, presence. But I think in some ways, like, that has to be almost demonstrated to them or explicitly asked for, because people are really, like, social media has this perfection paralysis element to it too. People don't want to say the wrong thing. They don't want to do the wrong thing because it's captured. It can be screenshotted. It can be, like, taken out of context. It can be just all of these things where, like, it can be really dangerous, and information can be just spread so quickly without any of that context. And so I really liked Suzanne's question about the responsibility and the accountability, because I think in some ways you have to just accept that it's never going to be perfect. And, like, who am I accountable to? Who am I responsible to? Whose advice am I going to take? Doesn't matter if you have 30 followers, 300 followers, 300,000 followers, whatever it might be. What is your ethic in an online space? How are you engaging with people, and how can you foster that in others through what you're modeling? Yeah, that was just kind of my thinking.
Does anyone want to pick that up?
I think the original, we were talking about the about how to stop, or like how to call allies in. Was that kind of the question? I think I was thinking about that in terms of how what I want from, especially in the art. I mean, I really can mostly speak for the art world and for like the art communities that I'm in contact with. I think that sometimes in these spaces that are more liberal, or I don't know, in the US, that's how I'd use that term, are more a lot of people who think that they're anti-racist, and institutions that think they're anti-racist, are other artists who think that they're anti-racist. And, now we see a lot of these institutions like marketing themselves and using their supposed anti-racism as a tool to make more money. When what I want to see is them to recognize that they are not immune to serious racist tendencies, because picking and choosing when something is racist enough to be an issue, versus like super, like the kind of, again, I'm in the US, Trumpian levels of outright racism, that there is, to me, there really there's no gray area. Once you can dehumanize someone a little bit, you can go the whole way. Once you can degrade someone's beliefs a little bit, you can go the whole way. I see this especially with appropriation, and I've gone back and forth in like terms of, okay, so I used to go to Coachella. If someone's wearing a headdress there, is it my job to go up to them, ruin my nice Lakota day, and explain to them and rip it off their heads, or any? No, I don't think so. I think that should be someone else's job. But then at some point I was like, okay, well, they're putting on the headdress. It's just like, to me, it's a big hat that says I'm an idiot. It's not going to physically, it's the headdress isn't going to hurt me, the Lakota woman walking around. But then we get into other forms of appropriation, like people online, working professional artists saying that they have like eagle medicine and they have spirit animals. On what level does that cross over and need to be stopped? Because if there's a difference between ignorance, I didn't know this was hurting anybody, and I know this is hurting people, and they've asked me to stop, but I don't want to, because I don't feel like it. I feel like I think I have a spirit animal. When you can't actually parse those things out, that's when I really need institutions to step in and say, appropriation is just one step in. It's more than a toe in to wider amounts of hate. It's not just a toe. It's the tip of the iceberg. It says, I don't think that your beliefs are important enough to me and I don't believe the history of the genocide of your beliefs to be serious enough for me to take this seriously and stop the behavior. So, but like, one person can't do this. Like, institutions and other members of the community who are not Native need to step in and say, I see, this is the tip of the iceberg. I believe you.
So much of this too, I mean, we're talking about, Megan entered a comment into the chat saying, we need there's superficial change versus systemic change. Systemic change has to come through education. How do we make this happen? To get to the point where people have the knowledge to step up, have the knowledge not to do these things, are able to address their own biases when they see something online. How do we get there?
I think that, again, Suzanne brought up a really good point, but I work really closely with Dr. Dwayne Donald. That's my graduate supervisor. And one of the things he talks about is like the need to unlearn before we relearn. And we see this in conversations about truth and reconciliation as well, right? People want to jump to the reconciliation piece before they're willing to acknowledge the truth. And so it's sitting with that discomfort before you're jumping into that's superficial. Like, do you want to look anti-racist or do you want to be anti-racist, right? Do you want to look like you support Indigenous peoples or do you support Indigenous peoples? Because those aren't always the same thing. And yeah, I absolutely agree that education is a key part of this. It's also like it's difficult because education was, used as a tool of oppression. but also education is a place of possibility. So I look at, some of the future teachers that I've had the opportunity to be alongside in their undergraduate courses, and just the shifts like from 12 years ago when I went through my B.Ed or finished my B.Ed, and I didn't even feel comfortable voicing some of these things, or I was just, like being able to name them because I felt them, but I didn't know what they were called, because like, what is, systemic oppression? Like no one talks about that in K to 12, 15, 20 years ago. But now I'm having these conversations with ninth graders. I'm having them with future teacher educators. So I just think that presence is so necessary, especially in university spaces. But it's difficult because I do see how Indigenous faculty and staff take on extra work. And they're educating their colleagues, they're educating students, they're being called to be on all these committees, they're just this extra workload. And so the education piece is important, but so is that systemic support, and that validation of different types of knowledge and service. Something that comes up a lot is, service to community. How is that valued within the institution, within education? So, yeah, I just think systemically, there's just so much that needs to shift. And until then, we're not going to see these like cultural changes that we want to. It's just going to remain on that very, like veneer, superficial level, paint over the mold kind of thing. And so I do put some responsibility onto like, schools, institutions, employers, to take this up. It can't be us as individuals only trying to do everything and support everyone. It's just impossible.
Does anyone else want to address that?
I'll just jump in really quick. As we're having these conversations and as, the other panelists are speaking, I'm just, I have worked since graduating university, I've worked at the Métis Nation of Alberta. And I think in a lot of ways I've been spoiled because I don't necessarily have to deal with some of the institutional challenges that other people working in Indigenous spaces have to. Most of the people that I work with, especially the people in leadership, are Métis, they are Indigenous. And it's kind of this idea, like for me, it's like as the Métis Nation moves into self-government, it's like, how do we bring ourselves up? And that's where my focus has been so intensely, for the past 8 to 10 years, is just focus on Métis people. And when I step, to collaborating with external partners, I'm always just shocked. I'm like, oh my gosh, like Indigenous people are fighting for these spaces. And I have seen it happen even within, my own organization, where sometimes I'm having to have conversations with, HR departments, and I'm saying like, no, I want to hire the less, the less educated, the less experienced Métis person over the non-Métis person, because they bring so much knowledge, community knowledge, cultural knowledge, relationships, kinship ties to the position. And like, as Métis people, I want to build ourselves up. I want to be, we're the Otipimsawak, we're the people who own ourselves. And I don't necessarily know the answers when we move into other institutional organizations, into universities, into governments. But I just think from my perspective, it's such a tricky thing. And I'm so privileged to have the opportunity to be focused on Métis issues with Métis people in a Métis self-government as we move towards, pushing for our own rights as a people. And I don't know if that necessarily answers the question, but it's just something that I've been kind of pondering when I think about how to answer these questions. And I'm having a hard time because my experience just isn't with focusing on how to bring Indigenous people into other spaces, because I'm so lucky to be so insulated with Métis identity and Métis culture. So.
Well, that's good. We have an audience question that's a bit related to that. Is there a role for NGOs and other organizations in promoting a safe online environment and speech equality? So what role can they play? Does anyone want to take that question?
That feels like a huge question. I mean, I'd say the same thing. Like, what are they doing within their organization, right? Like, you can't. And that's it. Do you want to look like you're doing it, or are you doing it? Because I think it's more powerful if you're doing the work within your own day-to-day existence as an organization. than to, host a session or to bring in a guest speaker once, or, have a elder come in one time or do the blanket exercise one time and it's just like a checklist item? Or is it like a living, breathing process that you're trying to live out in your day to day? So yeah, so that would be my answer is, what's the structural change that's happening within their organization that would give them the capacity to share out?
Excellent. Yeah, that's sort of, I say to my kids, it's easy when it's easy, but it's hard when it's hard. So another audience question, how much of an impact do we think the education system has on the hate that we see on social media, TikTok, Instagram, and so on? What are your thoughts on that? Megan, I know your expertise is in education.
I feel like I'm talking so much. Yeah, I mean, it's a huge piece, right? Like I said before, people feel comfortable to spout ignorance because it's gone unchallenged, and Canada has this story of nation building, right? And so people really, if their identity is tied to, I'm a good, proud Canadian, and we're challenging that, of course they're going to resist. Of course they're going to respond antagonistically. Of course they're going to, So I think that's part of, like when I was saying before, the unlearning before the relearning. We can't just, paint over this and expect like, happy days and everything's going to be okay and blah, blah. You really need to deconstruct first and understand why. Like, how was that cultivated in the school system? How does the curriculum, how does teacher education, how does assessment, how do all those pieces contribute to what we know about the Canadian national story, what we know about how we interact with each other? And again, I'm going to go back to Dwayne. Like, he'll talk about how that curriculum is really like relationship denial, that we've become separated from each other, that we've become separated from the natural world, which was something, Suzanne talked about as well. And that we're really like grossly consumed with like individualism. We're not thinking about the collective, and we're not thinking about the impact of our actions on other people. We're just so concerned with how it impacts us as an individual. So yeah, I do think a lot of that is rooted in the education system, which is founded on a certain set of ideals that occurred alongside the creation of Canada. So it's not surprising that, that's embedded into that existence even now, even though we're trying to make small changes, even though we're saying like, we're going to take up the TRC, or in Alberta, like teachers have what's called TQS 5, Teaching Quality Standard 5, which is related to foundational Indigenous knowledge. But again, it gets treated like a checklist of items instead of just an ongoing process of learning and relearning and relationship building. So how do we get there? I think that Indigenous scholars are leading the way, but yeah, it takes time and it takes support, and we're not there yet for sure.
Thanks, Megan. Any other thoughts on education and what needs to change in education?
Yeah, I just want to speak briefly from the U.S. perspective that while we are experiencing an extreme attack on education in the United States, it is so bad and it is so scary that while people might not be looking towards the effect on Indigenous people right now, there's the attacks on race obviously concern Native people too. And so revisionist history we're no stranger to that in the United States education system, but whatever gains that were made education wise are lost at the moment, as state by state Republican legislatures are literally editing history. I just saw them. I won't even describe. They're so painfully white supremacist and racist and so obvious that is extreme red flags about the fight that needs to begin in order, because education is where the only place where we're able to have interventions and other opinions in young people's lives to say that actually it's not normal to feel hateful towards people who don't have the same skin color as you. It's in schools that's like the first intervention that can happen. And if that goes away and it's normalized to not have a single living Native person taught in the classroom, to teach that important Black American figures weren't even didn't have anything to do with race. We edit out all gay and trans contributions. Those are just the beginnings of genocide, and that's of extreme concern. And while the racism that occurs at the kind of end point of experiencing hate online in the comments section and being attacked by people in one's community, while those are the symptoms of definitely the educational problem.
And while we're speaking about education, finally, we're able to bring in Catherine Martin, one of our panelists, member of Millbrook Mi'kmaq First Nation near Toronto, Nova Scotia. She's a filmmaker and producer, director of Indigenous Community Engagement at Dalhousie University. And Catherine, I'm not sure she's going. Thanks for being with us. Are you ready to speak about this? Oh. I'm not sure the audio is working there. Do we have the audio on? All right, I think you might be muted, Catherine. We're having a bit of difficulty there. I'm not sure. Are we able to fix that, Catherine? Yeah, you'll need to hit unmute in order for us to hear you. Oh, she says she has. I'm not sure if that's going to work. I'll just give it 1 second just to see. All right, I'm not sure about that. I think we're going to continue on. We're kind of coming close to the end. We had one interesting question, and I think you'd mentioned this a bit, Suzanne, but algorithm bias. They said the result of having a few people of color and Indigenous peoples in tech who build the systems. So how do we improve diversity within the industry there?
Well, that is, this another one of those extreme questions where the algorithmic bias is, getting people into these jobs is one thing, because people have started to enter these sort of jobs, but we know that once we have people in these jobs and we can't support them, they will leave. And so we can't just have like a few people building these tools. I mean, you also have to consider the ethics of the people who especially the great concern is people who monitor online hate. And the research and journalism that's been done on that has been amazing, because someone has to filter through all these. And usually it's not an upper level, white administrator at Facebook or Instagram. It's somebody who's not. And so then in order to get people in this industry, it starts with projects especially at Concordia with the Initiative for Indigenous Futures and the Indigenous Futures Research Center, and the not only asking how we can get people in the door into jobs, but how we can host young people as early as high school and say, how can we foster your interest in computational media, and how can we build paths for the people who come after us that are safer than the ones that we've traveled. I've been very blessed to travel very safe paths, especially into Concordia University, because I had two amazing Indigenous professors to mentor me, and to make they had already carved very safe paths for me. So I want to make sure the path I'm carving for the younger people behind me is just a little bit safer, at least.
Hi, can anybody hear me now?
We've got you now, Catherine.
Okay,
Thank you for
so I
joining
have 4 minutes. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
Well,
love
I
to hear
just
this.
want I just want to congratulate everybody for starting this. I hope that this is many, many to come. This is like a talking circle. It needs us to continue to have the discussion. And I've been following everybody. I just haven't been able to connect. So I've been really interested in and very happy to hear people speaking the truth. For sure, the younger children need to begin now. When internet first came out and Facebook and chat, and I saw a lot of issues, and way back then I begged people to really get hold of educating our youth, and more so the adults, about protocol and the lasting effects and the deadly effects of hate, digital hate. And we here in the Atlantic have experienced it in our communities, in the non-native communities. We've lost young children, and most likely we've lost adults who may not have let us know that they were alone and hurt and feeling hate. I know that we're missing a lot of values and morals and ethics these days, in not just in the education world but in our homes. And so I think that we could be of some help if we look at our traditional ways and our language. And that word hate, we were never allowed to say hate in my family. It was like a swear when you said hate. And so when I hear it, it just worries me so much. And because it's such a strong, not only a strong word, but a strong emotion. Look at the killings we're having all over United States and Canada, young children going in and being influenced by whatever, or older children or adults. And I wonder, what are they watching? What are they seeing? What are they being told online? And it's such a isolating place. You're getting threatened, you're getting stolen, you're getting there are so many predators out there that using hate, one of the strongest words I know, and using internet to put fear in people, drives many of them to take their lives. And I think we need to try to find ways to address that in the schools, at homes, and as a society. We also are experiencing, as I heard often on this broadcast, so much lateral violence online within our universities, especially lately over this identity issue. It's causing, as a Mi'kmaq, and I heard often some of our panelists talk about it, because we have treaty rights now, we're being attacked online and physically. We just had somebody shot someone in the leg because they were trying to practice their eel fishing rights. We tend to put things out here, and we don't, before we put it all out there, we don't spend any time looking at the regulations and the consequences and educating people about it. And I know we're out of time, so I just wanted to welcome you to Mi'kma'ki, but I also wanted to give you a chant to help us with our heartbeat, if that's okay. I'm not sure if we're just going to cut off at in 30 seconds. Could someone say something?
We have just we will have to say our goodbyes pretty quickly, unfortunately.
Yo, ya, he, ya, he, oh. Thank you, Great Spirit. for thunder in the sky. Thanks for the daytime and for the night. Thanks for the seasons that are part of life. Thanks for the way of our life. Yo ya he ya he yo. So I just wanted to say that if we spend more time looking at our traditional ways before internet, before this notion and strong emotion of hate has come into our territory, you know, we would find that speaking from the heart is speaking the truth, and it's the first language that we were given all over the earth from our mothers, the heartbeat. And maybe if we could go back to that time where we only speak good things from our heart, we might be able to help change the direction this hate online is going. Wilaliok and Amsitnogama.
Catherine, thank you. That was just wonderful. That's a beautiful way to end. Thank you so much. Thank you to Suzanne, Bailey, and Megan as well. We have so much to think about going forward, and so grateful to all of you. Now we'll go back to Lauren to wrap things up.
Thank you, Christy. I was on mute as well. You did a wonderful job moderating. We were so grateful to have you. And thank you to Bailey, Suzanne, Megan, and Catherine. I'm so glad you could join us, Catherine. You were all brilliant. I'm so excited that we could have you on. I really appreciate you taking the time. And to our audience, thank you, and stay tuned for more of our roundtable events. Goodbye.